I want you to picture a factory floor in Flint, Michigan, in the autumn of 1985. The air smells like hot metal and cutting oil. Sparks are falling in slow arcs off a welding line that's been running, more or less unchanged, since Eisenhower was president. And then, it stops. Not because of a strike. It stops because men in suits, men who have never once turned a wrench in their lives, have decided that the hands doing this work, hands that belong to fathers and sons and neighbors, are obsolete. In their place, robots, yellow-armed, humming, blinking machines, built at a cost that, by the time the dust settled, would eclipse $90 billion. $90 billion. In 1980s money, that's not a factory upgrade. That's more than the entire GDP of most countries on Earth at the time. And here's the part that still, honestly, keeps me up at night when I think about it. It didn't work. Not the way it was supposed to. This is the story of Roger B. Smith, a man who inherited the most powerful, most profitable industrial company the world had ever produced, and who became so obsessed with the idea of the factory of the future that he nearly welded his own company's coffin shut. This isn't a story about a villain twirling a mustache. That would almost be easier to tell. This is a story about a true believer, a man who thought he could out-engineer human beings entirely, and in doing so, forgot the one thing General Motors actually made. Not cars. Trust. To understand what General Motors lost, you first have to understand what it once was. In 1955, GM became the first American corporation in history to earn over $1 billion in a single year. Let that sink in for a second. $1 billion, when a new Chevrolet cost less than $2,000. By the early 1960s, GM commanded something close to half of the entire American auto market. Not a third, not 40%, half. 1 out of every 2 cars sold in the United States wore a GM badge. Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, Cadillac. 5 brands, 5 ladders of American aspiration, each one a rung a man could climb as his paycheck grew. I think about what that meant to a place like Flint. Flint wasn't just a city that had a GM plant in it. Flint was General Motors. The company was born there in 1908, when William Durant stitched together a handful of struggling carriage and automobile companies into one entity nobody quite believed would survive its first decade. By the 1970s, GM employed close to 80,000 people in Flint alone, in a city whose entire population was barely 200,000. Multiple generations of the same family, working the same plant. A kid graduating high school on a Friday, walking onto the line on a Monday, buying a house, a boat, sending his own kids to college. Off one union job, one high school diploma, no experience required, beyond a willingness to show up. This is the part outsiders always seem to miss when they tell this story. It wasn't a job, it was a covenant. GM made a promise, implicit but ironclad. Work hard, stay loyal, and this company will take care of you and your children for the rest of your lives. And for decades, astonishingly, it kept that promise. The engineering, in its own way, backed it up. GM, in its golden age, wasn't cutting corners. It was, for a time, genuinely the most technically sophisticated car company on Earth. The automatic transmission, the small block V8, fully independent suspension systems that European engineers studied and copied. GM's research laboratories, established all the way back in 1911, produced innovations that rippled through the entire global industry. By 1962, under Frederick Donner, GM's control of the American market touched nearly 50%, a dominance so complete that the U.S. Justice Department seriously discussed whether the company needed to be broken up under antitrust law. Think about that. The government wasn't worried GM might fail. They were worried it might never stop winning. And it wasn't just about output. It was about culture. A very specific, very American kind of confidence. GM's executives in this era weren't hiding in glass towers, disconnected from the product. Men like Charles Boss Kettering, GM's legendary head of research for over a quarter century, held patents by the hundreds, self-starters, safety glass formulations, refrigerants, and walked the same halls as the engineers testing them. There was a swagger to the place. GM didn't just want to sell you a car, it wanted to sell you an identity, a rung on a ladder. Start with a Chevrolet in your 20s, move up to a Pontiac or an Oldsmobile as your family grew, and if you really made it, retire into a Cadillac. Alfred Sloan, the architect of this strategy back in the 1920s, called it a car for every purse and purpose. And it worked so completely that generations of Americans built their entire sense of upward mobility around which GM badge sat in their driveway. I think about the workers too, not just the executives. The men and women on those lines weren't treated, in the post-war decades, as interchangeable parts. The United Auto Workers, forged in the brutal Flint sit-down strike of 1936 and 37. A strike that, by the way, workers won by physically occupying the factory itself for 44 days in the dead of a Michigan winter, had carved out wages, pensions, and job security that turned assembly line work into something resembling a professional career. A man without a college degree could, by the 1960s, own a home, put 2 cars in the driveway, send his kids to college, and retire with a pension that would carry him the rest of his life. That's not a small thing. That's the entire architecture of the American middle class, and General Motors was one of its principal engineers. That was the company Roger Smith inherited in 1981. Here's what Roger Smith was staring at when he took the corner office. Japanese imports, Toyota, Honda, Datsun, cars that American engineers had spent a decade publicly mocking as tinny, underpowered, disposable, were eating into GM's market share at a rate nobody in Detroit had modeled for. The 1979 oil crisis had sent Americans scrambling toward fuel-efficient compacts, just as GM's product lineup remained anchored to big, thirsty V8s. By 1980, GM posted its first annual net loss since 1921, a staggering, humiliating $763 million in the red. A company that had once out-earned entire nations, suddenly bleeding cash. And when Smith and his team went and toured Japanese plants, Toyotas, Nissans, they came back with a number that terrified them. Japanese manufacturers, by some internal GM estimates circulating at the time, could build a comparable subcompact car for roughly $2,000 less than GM could. $2,000 on a car that might retail for $6,000 or $7,000 total. That wasn't a competitive gap. That was an extinction-level gap. So Roger Smith did what a finance man does when he's frightened. He looked for a number he could throw at the problem. And the number he landed on was automation. Smith had seen Japanese plants using robotics far more extensively than American factories did, and he became, and I don't think this word is too strong, evangelical about the idea that machines were the answer. Not incremental automation. Total, revolutionary, top-to-bottom robotic transformation. He wanted GM plants that could build cars almost untouched by human hands. Factories so advanced, they'd make Japan's own plants look primitive by comparison. In 1982, GM formed a joint venture with the Japanese company FANUC, ironically borrowing the very expertise it was trying to leapfrog, called GMFanuc Robotics, dedicated purely to churning out industrial robots for GM's own plants. By the mid-1980s, GM alone was said to operate something like a fifth of all industrial robots in use anywhere in the world. One company, 1/5 of the planet's robots. Then came the acquisitions, and this is where the story stops being just about robots on an assembly line and becomes something far stranger. In 1984, Smith spent roughly $2.5 billion acquiring Electronic Data Systems, Ross Perot's data processing empire, believing computer systems could revolutionize how GM managed information and eventually manufacturing itself. A year later, in 1985, he spent close to $5 billion acquiring Hughes Aircraft, a defense and aerospace contractor, on the theory that its advanced electronics and guidance technology could somehow filter down into GM's cars and factories. A car company buying a fighter jet electronics contractor to help it build sedans. I want to be fair to Roger Smith here, because it's easy, 40 years later, to laugh at the logic, but understand the fear driving it. This was a man watching the most dominant industrial company in American history lose ground for the first time in its life, and reaching for the most futuristic, most technologically maximalist solution he could find, because the alternative, a slow, patient, unglamorous rebuilding of trust with the workforce and the customer, must have felt, to a numbers man in a hurry, unbearably slow. There's a phrase that circulated among GM executives during this period, one that captures the mindset better than almost anything else: the dream of the lights-out factory. A plant so completely automated, so thoroughly stripped of the need for human presence, that you could, in theory, turn off the lights and let the robots build cars in total darkness, because there was no one left on the floor who needed to see. Think about what that says. Not a factory with fewer defects. Not a factory that's safer for its workers. A factory with no workers in it at all. That was the aspiration sitting at the very top of Roger Smith's vision. And it tells you everything about how far the company's leadership had drifted from the covenant Flint had built its entire identity around. Smith poured resources into GM's technical center in Warren, Michigan, and into new flexible manufacturing concepts that promised a single production line could switch between building an entirely different model within minutes, using vision-guided robots and centralized computer control systems knitted together by the newly acquired EDS. On paper, in the glossy internal presentations Smith's team produced for the board, it was breathtaking. A fully integrated, self-correcting manufacturing organism, decades ahead of anything Detroit had ever attempted, and arguably ahead of anything Japan had built either. By the time Smith was done, GM had committed something in the neighborhood of $80 to $90 billion to capital spending and automation initiatives across the 1980s, More, by some comparisons of the era, than it would have cost to simply buy Toyota and Nissan outright twice over. And remember, this was money being spent by a company that, simultaneously, was closing plants and laying off tens of thousands of the very workers whose jobs this future was meant to replace. The company was, quite literally, borrowing against its own workforce's livelihood to fund the machines meant to make that workforce unnecessary. Here's the tragedy, and it's a genuinely sad one if you sit with it. The robots did not work. Not because the robots themselves were badly built. The problem was that GM tried to bolt cutting-edge robotics onto factories, processes, and management cultures that had never been redesigned to actually use them. You cannot drop a Formula One engine into a horse-drawn cart and expect it to win a race. At GM's showcase plants, Hamtramck in Detroit, the ultra-automated Buick City complex in Flint, robots were reported to be painting each other instead of car bodies. Robotic arms, miscalibrated or poorly integrated with the software meant to guide them, would install windshields with the wrong torque, sending them cracking down the line. Vision-guided welding robots, in some documented instances, quite literally missed their targets and welded doors shut. Line downtime at some of these factories of the future reportedly became worse, not better, than at older, less automated plants elsewhere in the GM system. The old plants, the ones still leaning on skilled human labor, were, in some internal comparisons from the era, actually outproducing the shiny new automated ones in both quality and cost per vehicle. And this is the number that I think tells you everything you need to know about the human cost of this bet. Despite spending roughly 10 times more per plant on modernization than competitors, GM's labor productivity gains during this period lagged behind Ford and Chrysler, companies spending a fraction of what GM was spending. Meanwhile, the human toll was happening in parallel, and it was brutal. As GM automated and restructured through the decade, it closed plants across the country. And Flint, the company's own birthplace, was hit hardest of all. Over the course of the 1980s, GM's Flint area employment fell by roughly half. Tens of thousands of jobs vanishing from a city that had built its entire identity around this one employer. This is the wound that filmmaker Michael Moore turned into Roger and Me in 1989, a documentary that followed Moore's increasingly futile, almost darkly comic attempts to simply get 5 minutes with Roger Smith to ask him, on behalf of a dying city, why. Smith, by most accounts of the era, never really understood why the film, or the anger behind it, struck such a nerve. In his mind, this was rational restructuring, painful but necessary medicine for a company in decline. In Flint's mind, it was betrayal by the one institution that had promised, implicitly, never to abandon them. What made it sting even harder was the timing. This wasn't a company quietly retreating in the middle of a crisis everyone could see coming. In several of the very years GM was shuttering Flint area plants, the company was still reporting billions of dollars in profit, including a banner year in 1984 where net earnings crossed the $4 billion mark. To the workers watching their plant gates close, the message was unmistakable and brutal in its clarity. This isn't about survival anymore. This is about a different kind of math altogether. A math where their decades of loyalty simply didn't appear as a variable worth weighing against a spreadsheet full of robot depreciation schedules. I think about the individual moments buried inside that statistic, the roughly half of Flint's GM jobs gone. A shift supervisor who trained his own son on the same line his father trained him on, watching that line get roped off for robotic retooling. A woman who'd worked quality control for 15 years, walking past a humming, silent robotic arm that had, in effect, taken her job description and reduced it to a maintenance ticket. These weren't abstractions. These were the actual, specific human beings the factory of the future was built to replace. And in a cruel twist, many of the replacement systems weren't even reliable enough to do the job correctly on their own. Then there was Saturn. And honestly, Saturn deserves its own documentary entirely, because it's the strange, hopeful footnote buried inside this larger story of failure. Announced in 1985 and launched in 1990, Saturn was meant to be GM's answer built the right way. A completely new subsidiary, a different kind of company, as its own marketing put it, with a radically collaborative relationship between management and the United Auto Workers, built from scratch in Spring Hill, Tennessee, unburdened by decades of adversarial labor history. For a while, in the early 1990s, it genuinely worked. Saturn built real customer loyalty, real quality improvements, a cult-like devotion among owners that GM's other brands hadn't seen in a generation. But it was a single bright candle, lit inside a company still fundamentally organized around the old assumptions, and over the following 2 decades, starved of reinvestment and folded back into GM's core bureaucracy. That candle slowly, sadly, burned out. GM shuttered the Saturn brand entirely in 2010, one of the final casualties of the bankruptcy that Smith's era had helped set in motion decades earlier. By 1990, when Roger Smith retired, GM's U.S. market share had slid from the mid-40s percentile down into the mid-30s, a collapse of roughly a third of the company's dominance, on his watch, despite, or perhaps partly because of, the largest capital spending spree in the history of American manufacturing. I don't think Roger Smith wakes up in this story as a cartoon villain. I think he wakes up as something more unsettling, a warning. He was not lazy. He was not stupid. He was not indifferent to GM's survival. Quite the opposite. He was consumed by it. His mistake. If you can call something this consequential a mere mistake, was believing that the crisis facing General Motors was fundamentally a technology problem, when it was actually a trust problem, a culture problem, a problem of an organization that had grown so large, so bureaucratic, so many layers removed from the factory floor, that even $90 billion in robots couldn't bridge the gap between the executives making decisions in Detroit's Renaissance Center and the welders whose expertise those robots were meant to replace. The tragic irony, of course, is that Toyota, the very company GM was racing to out-automate, was having enormous success in this exact era with the opposite philosophy. Toyota's manufacturing system emphasized empowering workers on the line to stop production the instant they spotted a defect, treating human judgment as an asset to be trusted, not a liability to be engineered away. GM, meanwhile, poured its fortune into machines built explicitly to need human beings less. Roger Smith passed away in 2007. By then, GM had lost its title as the world's largest automaker to Toyota, a company it had once viewed as a scrappy, forgettable regional competitor. 2 years later, in 2009, General Motors, the company that had once earned more in a single year than most countries' entire economies, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy and required a federal bailout simply to survive. I keep coming back to Flint, to the empty lots where factory floors used to be, ground down now to gravel and weeds, nature slowly reclaiming what was once the industrial heart of the American century. The robots that were supposed to save this place are mostly gone too now, sold for scrap, or shipped off to newer plants somewhere else in the world, following the same restless logic that first sent them there. What's left isn't really a story about robots at all, is it? It's a story about a company that had every resource in the world to solve its problem the hard way, slowly, humbly, by listening to the people who actually built its cars, and instead reached for the fast way, the expensive way, the way that let executives believe they were changing everything without ever really having to change themselves. Roger Smith wanted to build the factory of the future. What he actually built was a monument to what happens when you try to engineer your way out of a crisis of trust. And somewhere in Flint, Michigan, under decades of rust and silence, that monument is still standing.